We can do a little bit of housekeeping while we keep admitting more and more people. So this is by IISD, the International Institute of Sustainable Development, and its flagship, or one of its flagship programs, the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. What we do is neutral reporting. So you'll find that I'm often trying to say the various positions of different countries or groups, and that's sort of what we do, is we try to provide that transparency to what's happening. And this is an effort in that. So we're going to organize this so that we have, unfortunately, me talking at you for a little bit and sort of just highlighting a few of the key thematic points that we're seeing. And then I'll try throughout to give you an idea of what to look forward to next year or next week. Oh, it's been a long COP. And then also we'll leave at least half an hour for some questions and hopefully answers to go with those questions. Great. Matt is now putting in the links so you can follow our coverage throughout. We're there to the bitter end, so the team was there late last night. And also I should definitely thank the EMB team. They've been troopers, especially Mari Liomi and Tomi Akanale, that were just workhorses on mitigation and markets for us. Joy Tan has been our adaptation guru, and Jennifer Bansard did a wonderful job bringing everything together in the first week. And all of the photos that are free to use with the attribution is Mike Muzakassis. Oh, I messed that name up. Sorry, Mike. So thanks very much for the team. They've definitely put a lot of hard work in. So Matt's now providing you links where you can receive our reports. So we email them out. It's the last thing we do before we leave the venue in the evening. And also the links there where you can see Mike's photos, which again, you can use free with attribution. So, all right, welcome everyone. What we're going to do, just since a few more people quickly crept in, I'll give you a quick highlight of week one, foreshadow what's to come in week two, and we'll save for questions and answers. The Q&A function will be great if you could put your questions in there, because we'll be collecting them, and at least half an hour will be to questions and answers. So that will help Matt kind of group similar questions and help us all out a little bit. The usual sort of caveat that I give with these webinars is that it's difficult for something like this big COP to kind of make it for everyone. And I can see from the attendance list that we have a wide range of people with varying expertise. So some of this might be really in the weeds. So if it's your first COP and you don't understand what I'm saying, bear with me. We're going to come back up. And for those of you absolute climate nerds like me, or perhaps more so, if it's too sort of obvious, don't worry, I'll try to get in the weeds a little bit for you. So bear with me, everyone, and hopefully this can be something useful for everybody here. So I'm going to start off. I think it's important maybe to I'll start off with a bit of context and just kind of setting the stage for what this COP is all about. And then highlighting a few big issues. Obviously, I'll start with loss and damage finance. That's the big things for this COP. Finance generally, there's so much finance on this agenda. So we're going to spend a bit of time there. Adaptation, and then also these cover decisions. We'll go over what they are, and maybe what we could potentially expect to see next week on them. So for this COP, I mean, before coming here, I think of the word of the year was something like mega crises or perma crises, right? So we have a war in Ukraine that's sparking inflation, cost of living concerns. It's increasing the debt burdens of developing countries, also developed countries. And there's sort of political pressures against how palatable additional finance might be back home. There's also an energy crisis, although recently the IEA, the International Energy Agency, indicated or hinted that actually the high price of fossil fuels might be contributing to the rapid deployment of wind that we're seeing. We also have tensions between US and China. And traditionally in the climate process, when US and China can get along and issue some bilateral statements, or they've had some cooperation, we tend to see what they're okay with in the negotiations. The wording tends to materialize because it signals what the world's two biggest powers are okay with. We haven't seen any climate cooperation since Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. And so we're really not sure right now. Apparently, the two countries are talking, but it's not clear at what level and what about. Something at least that I've been noticing, and I'd be curious what others on this webinar think, is I've been seeing this shift, maybe in civil society into somewhat science about, keep 1.5 alive, yes, but also every fraction matters. And that, to me at least, feels a bit new. 1.5, keeping 1.5 alive was the mantra of Glasgow. And so I'm wondering to what extent this every fraction matters might be a bit of a recognition that we're really not on track. But certainly we want to avoid any kind of overshoot situation where we're exceeding 1.5 and coming back down, because that, as the IPCC has told us, has some pretty scary consequences. Within the negotiations, we've heard some countries really wanting to stick to the language of the Paris Agreement when it comes to temperature goals, which is 2 degrees aiming for 1.5, or sorry, well below 2 degrees aiming for 1.5. So in the mitigation work program, so that pre-2030 work program that's supposed to help ramp up mitigation action, that's the kind of pushback we're seeing. Remember the goals of the Paris Agreement, it's actually 2 and aiming for 1.5. What's this COP about? I mentioned Glasgow. Glasgow had a lot of pressure on its shoulders. It was the first COP since the Paris Agreement really started working. It was an effort to kind of show that the Paris Agreement was working, that it could work, and it had really mixed outcomes. It finalized the rule book for the Paris Agreement, but it didn't bring enough pledges forward to get us under 2 degrees. This COP has a slightly different job. So this COP is about implementation. We're not looking for big announcements. We're not looking for a big outcome. We're looking for advancing the work that's happening and ensuring that the work here can help countries, but also that it sets us up for success for the next 2 years, which will be bigger COPs with perhaps more expectations of some meaningful outcomes. So we have the Global Goal on Adaptation, that's a work program. We have the 2030 mitigation work program going. We've had the Global Stocktake Technical Dialogue, that's gone all this first week, it just wrapped up. So what we're seeing is a continuation of work programs throughout this COP. We've also sort of noticed some transitional issues, sorry. So, moving from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement, it's been a bumpy ride for several years now. And with that, especially now, we're moving away from negotiation dynamics, or we're supposed to be, and we're supposed to be moving more towards the implementation dynamics of the present. So that sort of effort is part of what we're seeing here. And sometimes it's technical, like how to move credits from the Clean Development Mechanism under the Paris Agreement Article 6. Sometimes it's principled. So while developed countries might be saying we're under the Paris Agreement era and everyone has to contribute, there's still pushback for that because we're still under the convention with common but differentiated responsibilities. And this burden sharing argument that many of us probably know quite well, we're still seeing it come up. So the mitigation work program, for example, there was the suggestion this week of referring to current emission levels and identifying the countries in the best position to reduce those emissions. So sort of this category of major emitters, which would be new in the vocabulary and the categories of UNFCCC. That obviously came against some pushback because a lot of developing countries, and especially larger developing countries, said, well, the critical decade was actually last decade. And we didn't see action by developed countries, and they want to refer to historical emissions. So we're seeing perhaps older conversations continue to play out under the Paris Agreement because there really are different interpretations of who does what in the Paris Agreement and how heavily the burden should fall on some shoulders versus others. So we're still seeing this. We're also seeing transitional issues from reporting under the convention to reporting under the Paris Agreement's Enhanced Transparency Framework, particularly around supporting developing countries. So this week there were calls for stepping up support because the Paris Agreement has a pretty robust architecture for reporting that all countries have to do. And so I think the call specifically made was 1 million per year for each developing country party to be able to fulfill this requirement. And reporting in the Paris Agreement is a legally binding obligation. So submitting those reports is really important for developing countries. And then the last sort of transitional issue that we're seeing is the adaptation fund. And some of you will know that this has been a conversation for some time, moving the adaptation fund so that it serves the Paris Agreement perhaps exclusively. This is going to take time. Discussions are frankly stalled because in the fourth review of the adaptation fund, which would have been under the Kyoto Protocol, there were a lot of reminders, let's say, that this is a transitional period. And when it's under the Paris Agreement, there will be a wider range of parties, and particularly some developed country parties that are under the Paris Agreement and not under the Kyoto Protocol that are going to have a say in some of this. So hopefully they could iron that out. But I think this will be sort of still an ongoing conversation. So loss and damage finance. That has been sort of the big attention getter and news, really. And it is historic. It is the first time that the UNFCCC has talked about finance for loss and damage. This isn't the first time that loss and damage has been on the agenda. I've seen that reported quite a bit, but we've had the Warsaw International Mechanism since 2013, and loss and damage discussions were years before that. So what we're really talking about here is the finance part. And so this was difficult. In June, there was a group of countries that asked for this to be on the agenda, and it was blocked. This time, it was the entire G77 in China, so all developing countries requesting this to be on the agenda. It was a much harder thing to resist, in a way. Rachel Kite had a great quote this week that it's a logjam, but it seems a few of the logs have shifted a bit. So there is a bit of movement here. Now, the scope of these conversations is really important because when agendas are set and when new agenda items are added, it's a deeply political process. They negotiate the agenda. And so with this, they carefully negotiated what the COP president said. So there will not be any conversations about compensation or liability. Those are excluded from the conversation. This will include the Glasgow Dialogue on loss and damage. It will conclude in 2024. And just keep in mind sort of the timelines for a lot of these issues. So the loss and damage finance conversation will conclude in 2024. That's the same year that the new collective quantified goal on finance, that those discussions are supposed to finish. So that means we have two parallel new finance processes going. And it's not clear at this point how or whether they'll interact, whether or not there will be some sort of cross-fertilization of them, or if they will stay two parallel tracks. But they're really trying to end up at the exact same meeting. So it'll be very tricky to see how that happens or whether that happens. One thing that's really struck me about these conversations is that it seems to have opened up space for really innovative ideas about how we can go about climate finance. So there have been conversations around a windfall tax for oil and gas, a tax on super flyers, debt cancellation, or debt for climate swaps. And so it shows how the idea of inequity is really seeping into the process to look at more innovative ways of potentially providing finance to avert loss and damage or to address loss and damage. And the wording, the verb there that countries choose can tell you a lot about how they're viewing this item. Is it about avoiding loss and damage, which sometimes is adaptation or beyond adaptation, trying to make it a little bit less bad? Or is it about ex post, so after an event, for example, providing rapid relief? So pay attention to the verbs that countries use when they talk about this, and it will tell you where and when they think the finance comes in, which also then tells you what function they think it should have. So this is going to be a lot of opening volleys. They're trying to set up a work program here. So I don't think we're going to see a big bang outcome. If we do, I think maybe the strongest outcome potentially possible here is that, especially last night, there was a really strong call to decide on the establishment of a financial facility. It wasn't agreed to last night, but there was really strong call that at least a decision to say, we agree to establish this financing facility, and then maybe set up an ad hoc committee or some other body that would then make recommendations on what it should look like. This was the same model that was used when the Green Climate Fund was set up. So in 2010, it was established at the Cancun COP, and then they set up a committee to go away and figure out how to make it operational. So I think they're maybe drawing from the past here to think about the potential process that could help. So certainly next week, expect to see a lot on loss and damage finance. Also, just on finance generally, I mean, finance is all over this agenda. Usually it's the technical finance stuff in week 1, and then the COP and CMA finance stuff week 2, but there's just so much they've started early, really. So, there's current issues, and then we might see some issues pop up. So we have a couple sleeper finance issues still potentially there in waiting. Long-term finance has been a difficult conversation for some time. It was supposed to conclude in 2020. This was a forum to help track against the 100 billion goal, provide an opportunity to discuss climate finance amongst parties. Now it's still going because they haven't agreed to end it or to finish wrapping it up. And so some are saying, well, maybe we need to keep it for a year, maybe for 2 more years. And then just remember, we're going to have a new finance goal in a couple of years. So potentially there's sort of an inkling that this should stay. So I don't know where that's going to end up. It seems pretty stuck right now. There's also obviously the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. So again, this is a process that we're in. So negotiations are not going to wrap up here. We're going to get about, not even halfway through really. But some things that we're seeing are really interesting. So it's likely we're not going to have a goal, but several goals, and that these goals will be qualitative and quantitative, and probably some sub-goals. So we're really looking at sort of a cluster of ambition around climate finance, how to increase the overall amount, but also how to do things like making it more accessible, providing grants instead of loans, things like that to kind of really help developing countries actually be able to use the climate finance that may or should be coming. It's also been interesting that there hasn't been a lot of talk about actual numbers yet. And some countries, I think maybe Norway even said, maybe we should have this conversation in 2024, kind of wait to see. And I think potentially, this is a little bit of me guessing, to be honest, or maybe a lot of me guessing, that might be in recognition that we're in some pretty difficult economic circumstances right now. And so maybe by waiting a little bit, it might be a chance for this to turn around a bit so that countries might feel in a better position to be able to make some stronger pledges here. This is all being plagued by the ongoing debate because there is no commonly agreed definition on climate finance. There's been a bit of technical work done in the last year. That work's going to continue. Some are calling for one definition instead of the several definitions that are in the Standing Committee on Finance's report. Some want to make it very clear that non-concessional loans do not qualify as climate finance. And so that's going to be a conversation that's certainly ongoing, but that really kind of plagues our ability to track and mobilize climate finance if we're counting apples and oranges and we're not really sure if they're actually bananas, for example. Actually, that's not an example, it's a fruit salad, but you see what I mean. The sleeper issue here is Article 2.1c. So think way back to the beginning of the first week. The EU and the Environmental Integrity Group proposed a new agenda on Article 2.1c. So what this article says in the Paris Agreement is that climate finance flows should be consistent with low emissions development strategies, with sustainable development. So it's about aligning financial flows to the goals that we want to see. So this came forward, and there's a lot of room here for multiple interpretations of what this conversation and what this negotiation will be about. So it could be about bringing in the multilateral development banks. There's been a lot of talk here about the role of multilateral development banks and how they should be doing more to help reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. There's been some calls for reforming, for a new Bretton Woods. I mean, the UNFCCC can't tell the World Bank, go reform yourself, but we might see nods and efforts towards collaboration or towards some sort of MDB directed invitations. There's also been calls to increase the voluntary contributions to adaptation finance. The question is if that falls under Article 2.1c. So this is a big basket, but underlying it, I mean, all that sounds great, right? But underlying it is that there's a concern that developing countries have. They're a bit worried that developed countries could make finance conditional on mitigation. So they could say, for example, that you don't get the finance until it's being linked directly to maybe your NDC. So if something is in the NDC, then it'll be funded. If it isn't, then it won't. So there's been clear pushback from the African group not to link NDCs to 1.5 degrees or to 2.1c, because essentially the argument is this could be setting new targets for developing countries in sort of a de facto way. And so it's sort of a moving target that, we can't really expect, or they say that we can't expect them to implement when the finance isn't coming, and that it should be country driven. So we've heard, arguments around these sort of circles in the past, but I think Article 2.1c will be the new home for them, if we even have those discussions. So in the opening plenary, they sort of said, okay, the presidency will continue consulting on this issue. We'll hear more about it next week, hopefully. There are some informal consultations, but we won't see any negotiations about this until parties agree to whether or not it should be on the agenda, and if so, what is the scope and what is the mandate for those discussions. So it's one of those sleeper issues that keep track of. So adaptation, this has been very strongly highlighted by the COP presidency as a priority. We're in Africa. So this is an African COP. Adaptation has been central to the presidency's efforts and priority list. And we have an awful lot of adaptation on the agenda as well, kind of scattered about the different definitions, different agendas. The global goal on adaptation. So again, that's a work program. This marks the halfway point of it. And since it's the halfway point, and since it's a priority for the presidency, there's been sort of a push to say, look, we can have some kind of substantive outcome here. We can have something that really helps showcase adaptation and put the global goal for adaptation as a central outcome of this COP. So several developing country groups, the G77, the African group, the like-minded group of developing countries, AOSIS, they've all wanted a substantive outcome to kind of maybe adopt a framework perhaps that could promote action, it could support adaptation towards achieving that goal, and also would help review progress made towards the global goal on adaptation. There's been a little bit of, not pushback, but conversation around that, because developed countries have said, well, we have a week left. Like, we don't know if we actually have time to negotiate that. And so negotiations have been a little bit stuck. So what we saw last night was that this was under the subsidiary bodies. And since it's stuck, it will now go into this week. They couldn't finish. They had procedural conclusions that forwarded to the SB chairs. And we'll see this continued conversation this week. So hopefully that provides a bit of time. So some developed countries, what they're suggesting is a series of detailed workshops. So maybe 4 workshops in 2023 to help detail out how to operationalize the global goal. So rather than a framework, maybe start exploring the different aspects of it. And, some of the worry about that some of the framework proponents have said is that, we don't really want talk shops. We want to make sure that if we do have workshops, that they really are part of a work program and meets the global goals objectives. So this is sort of one of those cases where everyone's sort of feeling out what's possible at this COP, knowing that they have another year ahead of them. And that this is coinciding a little bit because next year we have the political outcome of the global stocktake, which will also be assessing efforts towards adaptation and the global goals. So again, we have some things happening in parallel, which sometimes complicates matters. So last, and then we will get to your questions. I see a few coming in. These cover decisions. So this is a feature of very modern COPs, I would say. It used to be that a cover decision was a decision when there was a really big mandate, and so there's a big chunk of work. So, for example, in Paris, when countries adopted the Paris Agreement, there was a cover decision, and what it was we adopt the Paris Agreement, it's attached, and we need to do a bunch of work before 2020 to make sure that the Paris Agreement's good to go and it's ready. And so it detailed out all of that work and how that was going to happen. That's the kind of cover decision that we used to see. Starting in 2019, also in Glasgow, and it seems this year as well, we'll have cover decisions that seek to do a little bit more. So there isn't a mandate for this, just like there wasn't in Glasgow last year or in Chile the year before, or Chile, Madrid. So we're trying to figure out sort of what could go in this potential cover decision. And so the first meeting amongst heads of delegation was yesterday, and there were several talks of the interlinkages between climate change, biodiversity, and also a strong call to continue the work on the ocean climate nexus. So the ocean has been an issue that's only been popping up in these cover decisions, which means it's at risk of being lost every year because there isn't an ongoing agenda item to continue these negotiations. There were several requests in the heads of delegation meeting about finding a space in these cover decisions for Article 2.1c. Maybe that's where we see some of the multilateral development bank language go. Adaptation, I think we can certainly see, or guess will feature prominently. I think we'll also see a statement about accountability. So there are presidency consultations that will happen in the week to come on follow through on Glasgow and follow through on the Glasgow Climate Pact. And so that will be a look at what have countries done to follow through. I had a read of the Glasgow cover decisions on the flight on the way here, and some of it is easily trackable, an invitation to bring new NDCs or update your NDCs, or for developed countries to double adaptation finance from 2019 levels. Some of it's very difficult to kind of track or even get a sense of how you would track it. So we might kind of see amongst the many pages that those decisions were, a bit of picking and choosing a little bit. And some of that might just be the nature of the original decision itself. And some of that might be conversations about what to take forward. There's questions, because I think we all remember from Glasgow, a long protracted conversation around phasing down unabated coal and potentially phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. There's a big question on what's going to happen with that language. So there's been suggestions that really it's developed countries that need to be taking the lead here on phasing out, as long as, and some have said, look, as long as fossil fuels exist, we might have to use them. And that's, that's developing countries' views because of the need to develop and feed their economies. But also some developed countries are starting to look at some existing fossil fuels and say, we might need those given the current economic situation and the price of energy. So, there's this big temptation there right now to exploit untapped or stranded assets. And so it's really a question what will happen with that language in the cover decisions. We've heard that they're only going to have 2 to 3 sessions next week to talk about cover decisions. To me, that seems a bit ambitious, but it might also signal that they're reining in their ambitions for these cover decisions, that they're not going to look at launching a whole bunch of new work, that it really will be about let's focus on implementing all the rules we have instead of starting new dialogues, starting new work programs, trying to set new rules. The presidency on Friday indicated that the cover decisions would capture the progress in and around the negotiations. So again, we might just see more of a taking stock type of cover decision. That will also bring in some of the work from the Marrakesh Partnership and some of the other efforts that we've seen that are outside the formal negotiation space. So it might hint at what might be in these cover decisions a bit in terms of their scope and ambition, or we might see a lot of late night talks about cover decisions like we did in Glasgow. So I'll stop there just to make sure that we have time for questions, if that's okay. And thanks for your patience with my internet. It's, well, I don't want to jinx myself and say it should be fine.
Great. So please do use the Q&A function, although we are keeping eyes on the chat. Start with a question about Earth Negotiations Bulletin.
All right.
Why does ENB not list the name of countries when reporting back on comments made, particularly in contact groups or in huddles?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you'll read our reports and sometimes you'll see country names and sometimes you won't. And part of that is just the nature of our relationship with the Secretariat and our access. So sometimes we can get into some pretty closed rooms on the condition that we don't report names. So usually the rule is if it's informal consultations and they're closed to observers, we don't report the country's names. But if something is open to observers, we try to get permission to report countries' names as much as we can, because we do know that that is really helpful for everyone to track what's going on.
Several weeks ago, Denmark made a specific financial commitment for specific loss and damage projects. Have any other governments made specific loss and damage financial commitments?
I know Scotland has. They made a first pledge in Glasgow, and I think they've upped it. And there is a third country, also with a female leader, that's escaping me right now. I almost want to say Finland, but I might be wrong. New Zealand, thanks you. I knew someone would save me. Yes, so those are the only three. So we have Denmark, Scotland, and New Zealand.
So this is from an anonymous attendee who wants to clarify they're not asking a rhetorical question. How can we talk about loss and damage without talking about compensation or liability?
Yeah, and I think that's the trick right now that they're trying to scope out and figure out. This is, oh, and Sabine is saying Austria also contributed some finance. So thanks for that, Sabine. This is really tricky. And I know developing countries, especially small island states, view this as compensation, right? They didn't cause the problem and they're suffering the worst effects. So to me, the conversation will probably have to be had at some point. But right now it's out of scope. And so that's why I was mentioning the verbs, whether they're addressing loss and damage, whether finance is trying to minimize, avert, because that might give us a hint to what they're thinking. So I've heard that, you know, it might go back to kind of mundane things like insurance schemes, rapid deployment of humanitarian assistance, early warning systems, things like that. Maybe that's a bit more technical. But yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you at some point, because it is so important for a lot of small island states and other countries. This has to become potentially a compensation type of conversation.
I think this is a question asking for clarification. Mm-hmm. Besides existing funds such as the GEF, Special Climate Change Fund, Least Developed Country Fund, the GCF, loss and damage funds will be additional?
That's the idea. So in the GCF, there is a window for loss and damage, but it is sort of the early warning system type of thing. But, you know, we have loss and damages that we know are going to come. We know that more people will have to be relocated from their homes. So potentially that is a call for new finance. But this is really thinking about a loss and damage facility like financing facility standalone, to my knowledge. But we'll see what happens, right? 195 countries have to agree. So it's all up in the air.
What do you think about Brazil's role at COP27? We've heard that Lula da Silva is going to be coming week 2. And perhaps you can use that to bridge to talk about global leaders in general being involved in COP.
Yeah, so I mean, I think everyone was really happy to hear da Silva's statements about the Amazon, because the Amazon is vital for regulating global climate. And it's an area that, you know, eyes have been focused on. I mean, since I was a kid, it was called the lungs of the world, right? So we've seen Brazil really strongly maintaining a very long held position about the historic responsibility of developed countries. And that goes way, way back. So that's not new, but it's also not recently different. So we'll see how that changes quite a bit. We may see, especially perhaps in the markets conversations, forests are very important for the market. And so maintaining safeguards, and especially Brazil is keen to have removals from forests, which means when the forests basically suck up carbon dioxide out of the air, that could become a potential credit. In terms of the leaders generally, I mean, I was not surprised, but a little surprised that there was such a big leaders' presence here, because to be a little bit blunt, they don't have anything to do at this COP. So in Glasgow, they had a really strong role to signal that the Paris Agreement could work, to hopefully bring better NDCs with them and pledges, make financial pledges in person, you know, and it was just coming, well, we were still in COVID quite strongly, but it really was the chance for them to get together for the first time in quite a long time. So there was a role. Here, it's an implementation COP. And so without sort of an accountability mechanism for them, many arrived on day 1, gave speeches on day 2, and flew home on day 3. Some didn't. So we've seen some heads of state from small island states and from other countries actually sitting in on, say, the loss and damage discussions. So we've seen some leaders really taking an active role, but we saw some fly home. Biden came yesterday to give a speech, or day before, sorry. And as you know, and da Silva will be here next week, but it's still a bit uncertain, really, kind of what the role is in some of these COPs.
In Glasgow, there was a lot of talk around repurposing 700 billion of harmful agricultural subsidies worldwide towards regenerative biological agriculture and landscapes. Has that conservation evolved or come up in talks?
I haven't heard it. The agriculture conversation under the Cornivia Work Program seems to be following a similar pattern that it has recently, where there's quite a few divides around the extent to which mitigation versus adaptation is covered, how to really bridge that gap. And then it goes very underground into some very informal conversations. And we're still waiting for it to kind of emerge a little bit. Largely, I think, with procedural conclusions last night. But I admit I have not read that particular document yet.
There's a question about a report that came out from the high-level expert group from the UN on net zero from non-state actors. How is that report met at COP? And do you have any insights on what will be next steps for following up on implementation?
Yeah, this is a really interesting report, and it was promised by the Secretary General after Glasgow that he convened an expert group that would think about and figure out how to kind of tell the real net zero commitments from the greenwashing. And unfortunately, the report was pretty damning in terms of there's an awful lot of greenwashing happening. It certainly has played a part during COP this week, not in the negotiations themselves, because the non-state actor stuff is sort of parallel to, but also very important. Potentially, this could be something a few countries want to see in the cover decision, but maybe not, to be honest. That might be a little bit more embarrassing for some than others. So it's had some uptake, and I think it's had uptake on the side rather than the middle itself in the actual negotiation process.
Stepping out to a broader question from someone joining us from Iran. how can I be a leader of sustainable development and climate change in Iran? Just a sense that not seeing a lot of action from their government. So what is the advice? You're an instructor. What advice do you give students? What advice do you give people who want to get involved in this process or involved in climate action more generally?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, probably there's also people on this call that can provide a lot of help as well in the chat. So I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers here. My first line is always talk to the people around you. Talk about why it matters to you. Talk about why you care. Talk about things that can happen. Have conversations with those near and dear. Just because I think if we talk about it, then it stays in people's minds a little bit, and that can help. Also, try as much as you can, if possible, to build networks outside. So build networks with people who care outside of Iran or outside, even the region potentially, just so you can stay up to date and informed, and you can help share information about what's happening. As much as sort of is appropriate and safe that you want to do, but often it's sort of getting informed yourself, which you certainly, I'm guessing, are, and having conversations with people. One-on-one conversations can sometimes be very powerful.
Have there been any highlights or any important developments, any statements about nature-based solutions, restoration of ecosystems coming into COP27 so far?
That's a really interesting question, because there is such a strong link between biodiversity and climate, but in the UN system, they're treated totally separate processes. And we have the we have the, I guess I'll say, challenge of there's also negotiations going on for the future-facing global biodiversity framework. So we have parallel processes happening right now. I think a lot of the nature-based solutions conversations are happening in the non-state actor space. But I think that cover decision might reference some of this, because there was quite a bit of chat about, recognizing the role of biodiversity. Also because several countries year before last year, signed the Nature's Leader, or the Leaders Pledge for Nature. There we go. That also reference quite strongly the links between climate change and biodiversity. So hopefully we start to see these knit together a little bit better. But yeah, I think it will be potentially, if it does have any home in the negotiations itself, it might be in the framework for non-market-based approaches to climate change. Although the idea of ecosystem services might be a little contentious.
This is from Simon Evans. Do you think India's proposal on phasing down all fossil fuels has any legs? And is this not the same thing as what was the compromise text, what was proposed in Glasgow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Glasgow text also reared its head in a response measures negotiation where one developing country delegate said either put the whole paragraph in or don't put it in at all. Because remember, the second half of that, after talking about coal and fossil fuel subsidies, talks about the need for finance and just transition. So that paragraph in its entirety is a tricky, tricky balance to take forward. India's suggestion was interesting, and I think maybe they were saying, actually, it's developed countries that need to do all the phasing out. So that's a very different sort of nuance, I think, that matters there. I don't know about legs, to be honest. Simon, I'm also in the UK, and there is chat about opening a coal mine. So I'm not sure how far we're going to get with that one, but it's an interesting idea.
We'll go a bit into the weeds.
Uh-oh.
Do you have any insights on what it'll mean that the negotiations on the Joint Contact Group did not agree on a final declaration within the second periodic review?
Yes. So I think a lot of this is because there's been always this tension on this agenda item with the fact that the global stocktake is doing something very similar, but with a different goal. So for those not quite in the weeds, the second periodic review is of the long-term temperature goal. So is well under 2 degrees and 1.5 adequate. This dates back to Cancun when 2 degrees was the only goal. And so we're only talking about 1.5 because of the first periodic review. So I think that this didn't get resolved because an outcome here might preempt a global stocktake outcome. And we're currently in the middle of the global stocktake. We're at the technical phase. So I think it's a timing issue, and I think it's a little bit of pushback because some developed countries have frankly said, like, why are we doing this one? Because we have the global stocktake. So there might be a little bit of that tension as well.
I have a very general question, and you're welcome to provide a general answer about Article 6, which, just to note, that has not come up in the conversation so far.
Yes, I know, you got me. And I knew if I didn't, someone would call me on this. All right, Article 6. I was saying to Matt before this call, maybe 3 years ago, I could cover it and I was literate. And this COP especially, I'm realizing, oh my gosh, this thing is so technical now. So we're going to give it a go. Someone can correct me. The goal here is that we're trying to operationalize all of the decisions taken in Glasgow. So Glasgow really wrapped up Article 6 in a bow for the most part. But now we're in the weeds of how we're really going to make these markets work. So 6.2 is ITMOs. And the debate there is this just a database? Is it more formal and international registry that's going to have some rules about it to make sure that we can really ensure the credits being counted and to what extent we can have a CO2 equivalent type of measure? 6.4 is proving really tricky. And a lot of the controversy right now is around safeguards and around removals. And so right now, the removals language is very, very general. It doesn't really distinguish different rules for, say, removals by forests, removals from the ocean, or from ocean geoengineering. So this might be happening. So yeah, that's going to be a conversation that really has to be fleshed out, and also really operationalizing human rights safeguards. 6.8 is moving along, but there have been concerns raised that it's not getting the same attention as the other two. And then to layer it all on, 6.2 and 6.4 are supposed to play nice together, but not step on each other's toes. And both will have their own registries or databases. So how do you make sure that they could potentially be interoperability is the word they keep going for, but so that they can talk to each other as much as they need to. So yeah, that's as much Article 6 as I have right now. As I was saying, we have some absolute pros that are really sticking with that marathon.
A question for clarification. Is loss and damage, as seen on the COP27 agenda, peculiar to least developed countries or developing countries in Africa? What exactly does it refer to?
Yeah, so and what is loss and damage has been debate for a while, but it's not country specific, although it is widely considered to be for developing countries. It doesn't really make a difference if it's a small island state or an African country or a least developed country. And maybe some of the logs that have shifted in this logjam have been because developed countries are experiencing loss and damage, and maybe they're starting to understand what it's like. But yeah, so it's not really specific, but it is intended to mean support for developing countries only.
Can you speak a little bit more about the global stocktake and how you see the outcome at COP28 contributing to the Paris Agreement implementation? They observe it's intended to serve to inform NDCs, but what about adaptation, finance, loss and damage, and other cross-cutting issues such as human rights?
Yeah, so the global stocktake just has a heck of a job. So it's collective progress on mitigation, which informs next NDCs. It also is supposed to look at the collective progress towards adaptation, finance, capacity building, technology transfer and development. So the whole suite of major areas that we discuss. Loss and damage is a tricky place. It will have some role in the global stocktake, but it's not as explicitly recognized to my knowledge. So the global stocktake is supposed to inform next NDCs, but also all the other communications vehicles. So the adaptation communications under Paris Agreement or national adaptation plans, depending on which a country chooses to use. Similarly, it may be feeding into some of these loss and damage finance conversations, because we'll have the political outcome for the global stocktake next year. We have the loss and damage finance outcome the year after, and the new collective quantified finance goal the year after. So, we have major outcomes next year, but then also keep your eye on COP29, where we'll see the financial outcomes. So it could potentially be a link there as well.
When do you think countries will arrive at a consensus on a common climate finance definition? What progress do you think will be in the next year or so?
Next year, I wouldn't hold my breath. It's a principled issue and it's a technical issue, and that's what makes it really tricky. We've been sort of making do with, how the OECD and how other groups define climate finance. But there's a lot of challenges that countries simply define it differently in practice. But there's also challenges that developing countries want to make sure that it's still country driven and it responds to their needs. And so trying to reconcile those is difficult. I think we're years out on this one, to be honest.
What follow-up has there been on the Just Transition Declaration signed at Glasgow by developed countries, including the EU, which was highly aspirational, this person observes, but low on targets, actions, and funding?
Yeah, I haven't seen that much of it, to be honest. And that is the challenge of some of those declarations that happened, as some people were observing after Glasgow that these could be taking some of these things like the Global Methane Pledge or the Just Transition Pledge. Those could be housed in revised NDCs. So I haven't seen a lot of follow-up on that, to be honest, at all.
I'm going to awkwardly combine two questions or observations. In terms of inclusiveness, in terms of participants and agenda issues, what's your general feel on this COP compared to other COPs? There was another person asking about indigenous groups, about civil society, about how welcome they are, not just on the margins, but in the heart of negotiations.
Yeah, it's interesting that civil society here at this COP has had several worries about its access, its freedom of movement, and so we saw the first time actually. That I remember seeing anything like this, that the usual march that we see around climate meetings was actually through the blue zone, and the blue zone is where negotiations happen. And so that was new, and I think perhaps a very direct way in some ways to speak to those engaged in negotiations. And so that was really interesting, to be honest, to see that go through. It's always difficult when the world leaders are here. Security clamps down. We saw this in Glasgow as well, that, portions of the venue are just shut, essentially. So I would say that's probably quite similar. It's difficult. We only have so much space in here, and observers speak in plenaries. It's rare that observers speak in contact groups or in informal consultations. So I would say that's quite similar as well, this COP to previous COPs.
There's some news circulating earlier on a high proportion of oil and gas lobbyists actually in the conference. Part of delegations, I believe. Has there been any evidence of this impacting in any way the discussions or the negotiations, perhaps in a point that didn't advance?
Mm-hmm. I can't think of any, and the academic nerd in me, for my other hat, would love to see that data.
Because we're at the end of the hour and wrapping up, and our apologies that we can't answer every question. I'll go to, what do you think were the most relevant takeaways from week one as we head into week two?
For me, it's the number of issues that can and were sent to this week coming up. So we have a busy week ahead. We have global goal and adaptation. We have loss and damage. We have mitigation finance program. We have a whole lot of finance on our plate. It's going to be a very busy week, and the extent and how various ministers get involved and how they convene those negotiations are really going to matter, especially in that end game. I also just want to quickly say the chat's been fantastic, and I've seen some excellent resources being shared there. Thanks, Jane. You did catch me on the OECD bit. And so, yes, Gloria is asking about the oil and gas lobbyists, and I was just going to say the UAE is hosting next year's COP. They have sent an absolutely ginormous group here to learn how to do a COP successfully, and a lot of them may have associations that could have lumped them into that category. But yes, please do. The resources in the chat are fantastic, and so I really thank you for that. Actually, I've learned quite a bit through this webinar too. Thank you very much, everyone. Happy to chat. Reach out during week 2, and we're at your disposal if we can help out in any way. Wishing you all a safe COP and safe travels home if and when, or if you're already home, I guess just over to your couch. But yeah, thanks very much.